Hi everyone. So this is the first part of cognition. And that term cognition, you need to remember, really just means thinking. And we need to narrow down exactly what is thinking because sometimes when I think of psychology, I think psychology is thinking. Well, thinking refers to everything that involves knowing something, understanding something, remembering, and communicating. Now, this is an entire school of psychology. So, the cognitive school or approach is its own right, just like the psychodynamic school, just like the neuroscience school. And cognitive psychologists study these four areas in great detail. We've got concepts, problem solving, decision making, and judgment formation. Here's a definition of concept. And when we're thinking about concepts, usually this understanding of a concept is based on a prototype. What's a prototype? Well, let's take guys. We might have a concept of men that includes all of these lovely guys from Saved by the Bell. Yes, I love that show when I was a kid. Um, and the question is, are they based on our prototype? What's our idea of the perfect male and whatever? Um, and then and then when we develop this prototype, that prototype develops into an image. So our prototype generally is an image of something. So here's some other examples. So think about school learning. A lot of learning in school we might learn by definition. So a triangle is something with three sides. And through that concept that is defined, we then group all things with three sides. We call that a triangle. Now, the mental image research is very interesting. Here's maybe our prototype of a bird. Well, it takes a little bit longer for us to conceptualize a penguin as a bird because it doesn't totally match our prototype of a small feathered flying creature. This process of forming concepts and then putting that concept into a category actually affects our memory. So in this study, we have this computer generated face. It goes from 90% Caucasian to 90% Asian. When shown a face that was a blend of 70% of the features of a Caucasian person and 30% of an Asian person, people categorize that face as Caucasian. And later, when given these images, they recalled having seen a more prototypically Caucasian person. The image that they were more likely to recall was the 80% Caucasian person. And the same happened the other way. If shown a 70% Asian face, they later recalled a more prototypically Asian face. They did the same study with gender as well. So they had a 90% male person over here, 90% female person over here, and then a gradual shift. And the same findings happened in that study. Now here's review from the memory chapter, but it's a very important review. We organize concept into category hierarchy. So when we learn about a new thing, we put them into these mental categories. What's an animal? We have wild versus domesticated, and then we have different types of domesticated animals. And then if you think about dogs, there's different types of dogs. Now if we move away from our prototypes and category boundaries might blur. What do you think about a tomato? Is it a fruit? What about a 17-year-old female? Is she a girl or a woman? What about a whale? Is it a fish or a mammal? Now, when something doesn't match our prototype, we're slower to recognize it. And similarly, we're like this with an illness if our symptoms don't fit one of the disease prototypes. So, a heart attack is one interesting example. If you have heart attack symptoms like shortness of breath, exhaustion, a dull weight in the chest, that might not match the prototype of a heart attack, which is this picture, the sharp chest pain. And people who don't feel that sharp chest pain but have those other symptoms, they might not seek help. So what's important here is that these concepts that we form and these prototypes, just like other mental shortcuts we will encounter, they speed our thinking, they guide our thinking, but they don't always make us wise. So the next part of cognition that we're going to talk about is problem solving. How do you solve problems? Now, one idea is trial and error. Another one is algorithms. What's an algorithm? Really, it's a rule that guarantees the right solution to a problem. Um, Usually this is by using some kind of formula, and they always work, but they're sometimes impractical. Here's a really good example. If you were to unscramble these letters to form a word using an algorithmic approach, so you would literally write down every possibility, try every letter in every possible place, you would be facing 907,208 possibilities. That's ridiculous, right? In order to cut on the time, we use heuristics. Big word, simple definition. You could call it a rule of thumb. It's very fast and efficient, but prone to errors. So the first type, so we have two kinds of heuristics, representative and availability heuristics, that have been identified by these two cognitive psychologists. A representative heuristic is judging the likelihood of things or objects in terms of how well they seem to represent or match a particular prototype. So you meet a slim, short guy who wears glasses and he likes poetry. What do you think his job is? What is his profession? Ivy League professor or a truck driver? Well, what is your prototype of an Ivy League professor? What is your prototype of a truck driver? Well, most people guess Ivy League professor, but let's go down the statistics just to figure this one out. So how many professors do you think actually fit that description? How many Ivy League universities do you suppose there are? Well, maybe there's about 10, okay? And of the 10, um, how many classics professors do you think there are at each of these schools? Well, I don't know, maybe 4. So we've got 40 total Ivy League professors. And of those, what fraction do you think are actually slim and short? Well, maybe half. So now we're down to 20. How many of those actually read poetry? I don't know, maybe all 20 or maybe half. Now, thinking about all the truck drivers, and maybe there's a couple 100,000 truck drivers. Maybe there's 300,000, 400,000, 500,000. Let's just pick out 400,000 because that's what the textbook used. So of those, what fraction do you think are short and slim? Well, not many. Maybe, I don't know, 1 in 8. And of those, now we're down to 50,000 because the math works out so nice. What percentage do you think actually likes to read poetry? You might think, truck drivers who read poetry? Maybe 1 in 100. But even if you think 1 in 100 like to read poetry, you still have 500 short, slim poetry reading truck drivers, which is more than we have professors at Ivy League schools. So even if we accept the stereotype of what a professor looks like and what a truck driver looks like, the odds are still that this individual is a truck driver just based on sheer numbers. So you could say that though much quicker, a heuristic is always quicker, it's not always accurate. And next we have the availability heuristic. This is when we base our judgments on how mentally available information is. And really you can think of if we have an image or a story or some kind of personal connection, we rely on that more than maybe real data. So whatever eases the retrievability increases its perceived availability. So how is retrieval facilitated? Maybe it's a recency. How recently have we heard about some kind of event? How distinct it is and how correct it is. So where do you think you're more likely to get mugged? The Bronx or Gary, Indiana? Now, this happens all the time without us noticing it. Think about how casinos are put together. Now, even the little tiny wins are signaled by bells and lights. Woohoo, you won, you're a winner. So it makes that memory vivid to you. Well, when you lose at a casino, it's soundless, it's invisible. Now, if someone from one particular ethnic group commits some horrible thing, like an act of terrorism, our readily available memory of the dramatic event of this awfulness might shape our impression of the entire group. So when we study stereotypes, when we study race and judgments, really you could say a lot of this comes from our availability heuristic. This is really quite dangerous, especially when we have members of Congress make decisions about laws based on the availability heuristic instead of based on actual data. So your textbook says that even during 9/11's horrific year, terrorism acts claim comparatively few lives. And a few years later, in 2007, a poll showed terrorism was America's top priority for Congress. but responding to global climate change, which many scientists regard as a future Armageddon in slow motion. This is not my words, by the way, this is the research. This was one of the lowest priorities. So anything that's emotional with a mental image attracts this availability heuristic. We're more likely to remember that than we are likely to really remember data. And this is what leads to overconfidence. And if you remember from first try, our confidence is really not a good indicator of how right we are. This is one of the problems of how we think. And we have something called belief perseverance. So we want to maintain this belief even after it's been proven wrong. And then we have something called, and I'll let you read that definition. And I'm going to stop here, and then we'll talk about those matches on Monday. I hope you have a great weekend.